We are witnessing the absolute collapse of strategic rationality in Washington, and what happens when political desperation overrides military necessity is not a debate, it is a funeral procession. The recent decision by the Pentagon leadership to overrule field commanders and force the deployment of a high risk intelligence and targeting package into a contested zone is not just a tactical error, it is criminal negligence born of hubris. The party is over. The illusion that we can manage a war from an air conditioned office in Northern Virginia while ignoring the bloody reality of the battlefield is finally shattered. Yet the leadership refuses to look at the shards. We have a situation where the uniformed leadership on the ground, the men who actually understand the kinetic reality of the theater, issued clear, unambiguous warnings. They stated that introducing these specific ISR assets, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance platforms, linked directly to strike capabilities would be viewed by the adversary not as observation, but as direct participation in the kill chain. They were right. But they were overruled. Why? Because the political leadership and the four-star generals who have become nothing more than corporate CEOs in camouflage needed a narrative win. They needed to show that they are doing something, anything, to stem the tide of a war they have already lost. This decision to send a high risk package despite escalation warnings captures the essence of the entire catastrophe we have been watching unfold. It is the triumph of image over substance, of political wishful thinking over hard military facts. We need to be very clear about what this means. When you override a field commander on a matter of force protection and escalation control, you have broken the fundamental compact of military leadership. You are telling the world that the operational art no longer matters, and that the lives of the service members involved are secondary to the political objectives of the administration. This is a failure of doctrine, a failure of moral courage, and above all, a failure to understand the enemy we are fighting. This is not a counterinsurgency operation against men in sandals with AK-47 seconds. We are facing a peer industrial power with an integrated air defense system and a surveillance complex that rivals and in some specific sectors exceeds our own. The arrogance of the Pentagon to think they could slip this package in, provide targeting data, and not suffer consequences is staggering. It demonstrates a total lack of respect for the adversary's capabilities. And in war, disrespecting your enemy is the fastest way to get your people killed. The adversary has made it clear. If you provide the coordinates and the guidance for the weapon, you are firing the weapon. By overruling the commanders who understood this red line, Washington has essentially declared war without the industrial capacity or the political mandate to wage it. This brings us to the core reality that the Western media and the political class are desperate to ignore: the math of attrition. You cannot spin your way out of a math problem. The fundamental truth of this conflict, and indeed of all high intensity conventional warfare, is that mass matters. Firepower matters. Logistics matter. We have spent the last 30 years fighting wars of choice against weak opponents, deluding ourselves into believing that technology, small unit maneuver, and special forces could replace the sledgehammer of massed artillery and armored formations. We were wrong. The conflict we are engaging in now is an industrial attrition war, the likes of which we haven't seen since 1945, or perhaps even the First World War. The casualty ratios we are seeing are catastrophic for the proxy forces we are supporting. We are looking at exchange rates that are unsustainable 7-1, sometimes 10-1 in favor of the adversary in key sectors. This isn't Russian propaganda. This is open source intelligence confirmed by funeral notices, obituary data, and the sheer panicked mobilization efforts we see on the ground. When you feed light infantry into a meat grinder dominated by heavy artillery and thermobaric rocket systems. The result is not a valiant defense, it is a massacre. The Pentagon knows this. They have the satellite imagery, they see the thermal signatures of the destruction. They know that the average lifespan of a frontline soldier in the contact line is measured in hours, not days. They know that entire battalions are being rendered combat ineffective within days of deployment. Yet they continue to push. This intelligence package they forced into the theater is an attempt to use a technological band-aid to stop an arterial bleed. They think that if they can just find that one command post, that one ammunition depot, and strike it with precision, the entire enemy front will collapse. It is a fantasy. The enemy fights with a redundancy and a depth that we have stripped from our own forces in the name of efficiency and budget cuts. The attrition math tells us that the enemy can absorb losses, regenerate force, and continue the grind. Our proxies cannot. The West cannot. We have run out of 155 millimeter shells. We are scrambling to find air defense interceptors. We are stripping our own stockpiles in South Korea and Israel to feed a furnace that burns everything we throw into it. And amidst this logistical collapse, the genius move from the Pentagon is to escalate, to provoke a direct confrontation by deploying sensitive intelligence assets that the field commanders explicitly said were too dangerous to use. It is vital to understand that this is not a question of courage. The soldiers on the ground, the Ukrainians, are fighting with a desperation and a bravery that is undeniable. But bravery does not stop a 152 millimeter shell. Bravery does not jam a GPS-guided glide bomb. The failure here is not at the platoon or company level. It lies squarely in the E-ring of the Pentagon and the boardrooms of the defense contractors who sold us a bill of goods. They sold us the idea that war could be sanitized, that it could be surgical. They lied. War is blood and iron. It is mud and terror. And when you enter a war of attrition without the industrial base to sustain it, you are sentencing your proxy to death. The Pentagon's refusal to acknowledge the manpower crisis is perhaps the most damning evidence of their detachment from reality. You can send all the Patriot batteries and Abrams tanks you want, though we know they burn just like everything else. But if you do not have the trained, competent, and rested infantry to hold the ground, the equipment is useless. We are seeing the wholesale destruction of the demographic future of an entire nation because Washington refuses to admit a mistake. The operational trap is now set. By overruling the field commanders and deploying this intelligence package, the Pentagon has walked right into the adversary's kill zone. The enemy has been waiting for this. They have been shaping the battlefield not to take territory quickly, but to draw the remaining high-value assets of the West into a position where they can be destroyed. This is the essence of the attrition strategy. You do not chase the enemy, you let the enemy come to you, and then you annihilate him. The field commanders understood this. They looked at the map, they looked at the enemy's disposition, and they saw the trap. They saw that deploying these sensors and data links would expose them to immediate counter-battery fire and electronic warfare suppression. They knew that the moment those systems went active, they would be beaconing their position to an enemy that has complete fire superiority. Washington didn't care. Washington wanted a headline. Washington wanted to show the Allies that commitment remains unwavering. So they sent the package. And now we are about to see the consequences of substituting political optics for military strategy. We are about to see what happens when you bring a knife to a gunfight and then, out of sheer arrogance, you drop the knife and try to slap the gunman. The trap has been sprung. And the tragedy is that it was entirely preventable if anyone in the chain of command had simply listened to the professionals on the ground instead of the politicians in the capital. To understand why this trap was ignored, we have to look beyond the immediate corruption of the moment and examine the intellectual rot that has destroyed Western military thought. We are witnessing the total bankruptcy of the doctrine known as maneuver warfare. For the last 40 years, the United States Army and Marine Corps have worshipped at the altar of maneuver the idea that you can defeat an enemy by moving faster than him, by getting inside his decision cycle, by creating chaos in his rear areas. This concept, largely borrowed from a misinterpretation of the German Wehrmacht's tactics in World War II, works exceptionally well when you are fighting an enemy who cannot see you, cannot communicate, and has no air power. It worked in Iraq against a demoralized conscript army. It worked in Afghanistan against light infantry in the mountains. But it does not work, and it cannot work, against a peer enemy with a functionally endless supply of artillery and a persistent surveillance capability. The obsession with maneuver has blinded our leadership to the reality that war between great powers is not a fencing match. It is a wrestling match in the mud. It is about weight, leverage, and endurance. We built a military designed for speed and precision, assuming we would always possess total air superiority. That assumption is now dead. The airspace over the Ukraine theater is the most dangerous airspace on the planet. The Russian Integrated Air Defense Network, the S-300 seconds, S-400 seconds, and the new S-500 systems, has effectively denied the ability of conventional air power to operate with impunity. Without air superiority, maneuver forces are simply targets. When you try to conduct a sweeping armored thrust, like the disastrous offensive we saw last summer, without control of the skies, you are driving tanks into a shooting gallery. The Western mind, conditioned by Hollywood and decades of beating up on third-rate powers, cannot comprehend this. They look at the map and ask, why aren't we moving? Why aren't we taking cities? They don't understand that in the age of the drone, the battlefield has become transparent. The element of surprise, which is the cornerstone of maneuver warfare, has been erased. If you move, you are seen. If you are seen, you are targeted. If you are targeted, you are dead. This is the new reality of the transparent battlefield, and our doctrine has no answer for it. Contrast this with the Russian doctrine. The Russians never fell for the romance of maneuver in the same way the West did. They remained students of the destructive power of artillery. Their doctrine is historically rooted in the understanding that fire kills. They don't look for the elegant solution, they look for the effective one. What we are seeing now is the application of a methodical, grinding attrition strategy. It is slow, it is ugly, it lacks the cinematic flair that Western generals crave for their press briefings, but it is utterly devastating. The Russian approach is to use their advantage in fires, artillery, rockets, glide bombs to pulverize the enemy's defensive positions from a distance, minimizing their own casualties while maximizing the destruction of the opposing force. They treat the battlefield like a demolition project. They identify a grid square, they level it, and then they step forward. They are not trying to outmaneuver the NATO-trained forces. They are destroying them. They are forcing the West to fight a war of industrial production. A war where the winner is determined by who can manufacture more shells, more tubes, and more drones. And in this contest, the West is unarmed. We deindustrialized our economies to boost stock prices, while the Russians kept their factories warm. This brings us to the historical analogies that the Pentagon refuses to study. We are not in 1944 racing across France. We are in 1916 on the Somme, or perhaps in 1917 at Passchendaele, the defense has become dominant. The combination of minefields, trenches, electronic warfare, and drone surveillance has created a deadlock that can only be broken by massive firepower supremacy. In World War I, the generals eventually learned that you cannot send men against machine guns without overwhelming artillery preparation. Today, the FPV drone is the new machine gun, but it is a machine gun that can hunt you down, fly into your dugout, and chase your vehicle. The lethality of the modern battlefield has increased exponentially. A tank, which used to be the king of the battlefield, is now a metal coffin unless it is part of a highly complex combined arms system with electronic jamming, active protection, and infantry screening. We sent Western tanks, Leopards, Challengers, Abrams into this environment with the arrogance that the technology itself was a magic wand. We thought the sight of a German tank would cause the Russians to run. Instead, the Russians treated them as priority targets, destroying them with $500 drones and cheap mines. The image of burning Western armor is not just a tactical loss. It is the funeral pyre of the idea that Western technology is superior to the laws of physics. Why can't our leadership see this? Why do they persist in sending high-risk packages and demanding offensives that are suicidal? The answer lies in the composition of the leadership class itself. Look at the biographies of the people running the State Department, the National Security Council, and even the Pentagon. How many of them have ever heard a shot fired in anger? How many of them have an engineering background or a deep understanding of military history? Almost none. We are ruled by a class of social scientists, lawyers, and political operatives. They view war through the lens of liberal internationalism and legal theory. They think that war is a negotiation, a signaling exercise where you can calibrate violence to achieve a diplomatic outcome. They believe that if they issue a stern statement or pass a sanctions package, the enemy will alter his behavior. They do not understand that the enemy votes with steel. These leaders lack the technical competence to understand what they are asking the military to do. When a lawyer looks at a war, he sees a violation of international norms. When a soldier looks at a war, he sees logistics, range, payload, and terrain. The gap between these two worldviews is where soldiers die. We have a Secretary of Defense and a Chairman of the Joint Chiefs who are more concerned with the social engineering of the force pronouns, diversity quotas, and climate change initiatives than they are with the lethality of the force. They have spent years purging the officer corps of independent thinkers and warriors, replacing them with bureaucrats who are skilled at navigating the corridors of Washington, but incompetent at navigating a battlefield. This is the Macgregor critique that I have articulated for years. We have professionalized the wrong things. We produce generals who are excellent politicians, but terrible strategists. They treat war as a management problem, assuming that if they just apply enough pressure or leverage, the other side will fold. They cannot comprehend an enemy like Russia, which views this conflict as an existential struggle for survival and is willing to absorb pain that the West finds unimaginable. This intellectual failure leads directly to the catastrophe we discussed in the first part. Because they don't understand the technical reality of the war, the dominance of fires, and the transparency of the battlefield, they believe they can cheat the system. They think they can sneak an intelligence package into a contested zone and tilt the balance. It is the desperate act of a gambler who has lost his bankroll but thinks he can win it all back with one lucky roll of the dice. But in war, the house always wins, and the house is the side with the biggest guns and the most ammunition. We have ignored the fundamentals of warfare for the sake of political expediency, and we are now paying the price in blood and national humiliation. We have allowed men who treat war as a graduate school seminar to dismantle the finest military tradition in the world. They have replaced the hard science of war with the soft science of feelings and narratives. And as we move to look at the institutional corruption that underpins this, remember this: incompetence in war is not just a mistake, it is a verdict. The incompetence we see at the strategic level is not accidental. It is a feature of a system designed for profit, not victory. We must peel back the layers of the onion and look at the military industrial complex for what it truly has become: a massive, self licking ice cream cone. The Pentagon is no longer a war-fighting institution. It is the world's largest purchasing agent for 5 major defense contractors. The priority in Washington is not to field weapons that work in the mud and blood of Eastern Europe. The priority is to field weapons that generate shareholder value, sustain congressional districts, and ensure that general officers have lucrative board seats waiting for them when they retire. This is the systemic corruption that has hollowed out our military capability. We have built a force of gold-plated platforms that are exquisitely expensive, incredibly fragile, and utterly unsuited for high-intensity attrition warfare. We prioritize complexity over reliability because complexity costs more. A $20,000 drone from Iran or a mass-produced artillery shell from Russia is not sexy to the acquisition boards in the Pentagon. They want the $1 trillion fighter jet that can't fly in the rain, or the littoral combat ship that cracks its hull in calm waters. This corruption has led to a catastrophic technological gap, but not the one the Western media talks about. For years, we were told that Russian technology was rusty junk from the Soviet era and that Western technology was invincible. That lie has died a hard death on the steppes of Ukraine. Let's look at the Patriot missile system. It was sold to the world and to the American taxpayer as an impenetrable shield. It is the crown jewel of our air defense export strategy. Yet, we have seen it fail repeatedly. It failed in Saudi Arabia against Houthi drones, and it is failing in Ukraine against Russian saturation attacks. We are watching billion-dollar batteries firing multi-million-dollar interceptors at cheap decoys, depleting our strategic stockpiles while the enemy's actual warheads get through. The radar signatures are easily detected, the system is immobile and cumbersome, and once it turns on, it becomes a magnet for anti-radiation missiles. We sent these systems into a theater they were not designed for, against an enemy that knows exactly how to defeat them. And the result is the erosion of the myth of American technological supremacy. Meanwhile, look at the industrial reality of tank production. The United States and its European allies effectively dismantled their heavy armor industrial base after the Cold War. We treat tank production like a boutique craft industry, hand building a few dozen units a year. The Russians, conversely, treated the tank as a staple of warfare. They kept the factories running. They modernized the T-72 and T-90 lines. They have the capacity to churn out hundreds of tanks a month, refurbish thousands from deep storage, and put them on the train to the front. We are sending a handful of Abrams tanks, which require jet fuel and a logistical tail that stretches back to Poland into a muddy hellscape where they are bogged down and picked off. It is a logistical nightmare. The German Leopard 2, touted as the best tank in the world, burned just as easily as the T-64. The difference is Russia can replace its losses. We cannot. We have created a military that is a one-shot force. We have enough ammunition and equipment for the first 30 days of a war. After that, we are empty. We have no surge capacity. We have hollowed out our manufacturing base to such a degree that we cannot even produce enough gunpowder to fill the shells we need. While we were busy focusing on counterinsurgency and diversity seminars, the Russians were focusing on the high end of the physics spectrum. They understood that the U.S. missile defense shield, the very thing we withdrew from the ABM treaty to build, was the primary threat to their strategic deterrent. So they innovated. They leaped over us. Today, Russia possesses operational hypersonic missiles, the Kinzhal and the Zircon, against which we have absolutely no defense. None. There is no system in the NATO inventory that can intercept a maneuverable warhead traveling at Mach 9 or Mach 10. This is a Sputnik moment that the West is trying to hush up. When a Kinzhal strikes a command bunker or a Patriot battery, it arrives with kinetic energy that is off the charts. It is unstoppable. We are seeing the Russians use these weapons sparingly but effectively to dismantle the high-value targets that NATO provides. Furthermore, the Russians have moved into realms of nuclear propulsion and strategic delivery systems that we are only beginning to conceptualize. They developed these systems because they view the United States as a treaty-breaking existential threat. They saw us expanding NATO to their borders, placing missile launchers in Romania and Poland, and they responded with cold, hard physics. The technological gap is real, but it is in their favor where it counts. Strategic strike and mass production. We have better night vision goggles and better encrypted radios. They have better missiles and more artillery. In a knife fight, the guy with the better shoes doesn't win. The guy with the bigger knife wins. The Pentagon's failure to recognize this is derived from that same arrogance we discussed earlier. They assumed Russia was a gas station with nukes. They didn't realize it was a fortress with a sophisticated military-industrial complex that operates on a war footing, while we operate on a peacetime, for-profit footing. The tragedy is that this corruption creates a feedback loop of failure. When the Patriot fails, the answer from the Pentagon isn't let's rethink our air defense strategy. The answer is send more Patriots and give Raytheon another contract to upgrade the software. It is a grift. It is a money laundering scheme where tax dollars are converted into political donations via the mechanism of failed weapons programs. And the victims of this scheme are the soldiers on the ground who are looking up at the sky, waiting for air cover that never comes, and the field commanders who are being ordered to execute missions with equipment that is more marketing hype than military hardware. We have sent a high-risk intelligence package into this environment, relying on these flawed systems to protect it. We are betting the house on a pair of twos, while the other guy is holding a royal flush. This is not just bad strategy, it is institutional suicide. And as we are about to see, this technological delusion is pushing us toward a threshold that mankind has not crossed since 1945. The conventional failure is driving us toward the nuclear cliff. This conventional failure leads us directly to the terrifying precipice of nuclear escalation. When a great power cannot win on the conventional battlefield, when its Wunderwaffen burn and its proxies are ground into dust, the temptation to change the rules of the game becomes overwhelming. We must look at the history to understand why the Russians are not bluffing. In 2002, the United States unilaterally withdrew from the anti-ballistic missile ABM treaty. This was the cornerstone of strategic stability between the superpowers. The logic was simple. If I cannot shield myself from your missiles, and you cannot shield yourself from mine, neither of us will launch. It was mutually assured destruction codified in law. By walking away from that treaty, Washington sent a clear message to Moscow. We intend to build a shield so that we can strike you with a sword without fear of retaliation. It was an act of supreme strategic arrogance. Vladimir Putin said explicitly at the time that this would force Russia to develop new asymmetric weapons to penetrate any shield the US could build. We laughed at him. We called him paranoid. Well, nobody is laughing now. That betrayal of the ABM treaty is the father of the Kinzhal, the avant-garde, and the terrifying Burevestnik, a nuclear-powered cruise missile with effectively unlimited range. It birthed the Poseidon, an autonomous nuclear torpedo designed to irradiate coastlines and render them uninhabitable for centuries. These are not weapons of conquest, they are weapons of the apocalypse. They are the dead hand ensuring that if Russia falls, the West dies with it. The Russians developed these because they took our stated intent to neutralize their deterrent seriously. Now, we are poking that bear with a stick. The deployment of the intelligence package we discussed, coupled with the authorization for deep strikes into Russian territory using Western missiles, is crossing a bright red line. The Russians have stated, with perfect clarity, that they view the conflict in Ukraine not as a border dispute, but as a war for their national survival against the collective West. The most dangerous element of this escalation is the Tomahawk missile and the Mk-41 vertical launch system. We have placed these launchers in Romania and Poland under the guise of Aegis Ashore missile defense. We told the Russians they were for Iranian missiles. The Russians pointed out, correctly, that the Mark 41 launchers are universal. They can fire a defensive interceptor or an offensive Tomahawk cruise missile. And here is the nightmare scenario. The Tomahawk is dual capable. It can carry a conventional high explosive warhead, or it can carry a W-80 nuclear warhead. From a radar screen, you cannot tell the difference. If a salvo of cruise missiles comes flying over the Russian border from a NATO country, the Russian early warning radar operators have seconds to decide if this is a conventional attack on an airbase or a decapitating nuclear first strike on Moscow. What do you think they will do? Their doctrine is clear. If they detect an incoming strategic attack that threatens the existence of the state or its nuclear command and control, they launch. This is the launch on warning posture. By introducing weapons into this theater that blur the line between conventional and nuclear war, we are creating the conditions for an accidental nuclear exchange. We are removing the ambiguity that kept the Cold War cold. We are forcing the Russian leadership to keep their finger on the trigger 24/7. And now, with this intelligence package providing targeting data for long-range strikes, we are essentially hot-wiring the fuse. The Russians know that Ukraine cannot operate these systems alone. They know that American satellites providing the coordinates, American technicians doing the programming, and American intelligence officers pushing the button equals an American attack. We are sleepwalking into Armageddon because our political class does not respect the physics of nuclear war. They think they can manage escalation like they manage a press cycle. They think they can slice the salami, taking one small step after another without ever triggering the final response. They are wrong. The Russians have been incredibly restrained up to this point. They have not struck the logistical hubs in Poland. They have not shot down our surveillance drones over the Black Sea, though they have the capability. But that restraint is being interpreted in Washington as weakness. It is not weakness, it is calculation. But every calculation has a limit. The ABM withdrawal was the original sin. The current escalation with long-range fires is the potential final act. We are playing Russian roulette with a fully loaded revolver, convinced that the gun will jam because we are the good guys. The Russians have drawn a line in the sand regarding the survival of their state. They have signaled that they will use tactical nuclear weapons if their territorial integrity is fundamentally threatened. And yet, the Pentagon pushes this intelligence package is designed to facilitate strikes that could blind their early warning systems or decapitate their leadership. If that happens, all bets are off. The West has no defense against the response. We have no civil defense shelters. We have no population that is psychologically prepared for nuclear reality. We are a soft, consumerist society poking a hardened survivalist warrior culture in the eye. The betrayal of the ABM treaty sowed the wind. We are now on the verge of reaping the whirlwind. And when the mushroom cloud rises, it won't matter who had the better narrative on CNN. The only thing that will matter is that we ignored the warnings, we broke the treaties, and we pushed a nuclear superpower into a corner from which there is no escape but through us. The military catastrophe we have detailed creates a gravitational black hole that is now pulling the political structures of the West into the abyss. You cannot separate the battlefield from the bank account, nor can you separate strategic defeat from political instability. The reckless escalation we are witnessing is not a sign of strength. It is the death rattle of a failed order. We are watching the slow motion collapse of the European political project. The sanctions regime, which was sold to the public as a weapon to crush the Russian economy, has instead acted as a boomerang that has decapitated European industry. Look at Germany. The engine of Europe is stalling. Energy prices are skyrocketing. Factories are closing. And major chemical and automotive giants are moving their operations abroad. This is deindustrialization on a continental scale, inflicted by Berlin and Brussels upon their own people in servitude to Washington's foreign policy. The result will be the fall of governments. We are already seeing the tremors in France and Germany, where populist movements are rising not because of ideology, but because the average citizen can no longer afford to heat their home or buy groceries to support a war that was lost 2 years ago. NATO itself is facing an existential crisis. For decades, it has relied on the checkbook of the United States to mask the hollowness of its members' military capabilities. That checkbook is running empty. The United States is $35 trillion in debt. We are paying more in interest on our national debt than we spend on defense. The notion that we can simply print money forever to fund a stalemate in Ukraine while preparing for a war with China is a delusion. The economic reality is catching up with the geopolitical fantasy. The global south sees this. The BRICS nations see this. They are moving away from the dollar because they see the weaponization of finance and the incompetence of Western military power. We are isolating ourselves. We are turning the United States into a pariah state, not because we are evil, but because we are incompetent and dangerous. We are the flailing giant, knocking over the furniture, while the rest of the world quietly builds a new architecture that excludes us. We are left with a binary choice. It is a stark choice between reality and ruin. Option one is that we continue on this path of denial. We continue to listen to the generals who have never won a war and the politicians who have never worked a real job. We continue to escalate, sending more intelligence packages, more missiles, and eventually American troops into the meat grinder. If we do this, the result is guaranteed: the collapse of NATO, the destruction of the American economy, and a very high probability of nuclear war. Option two is that we accept reality. We admit that the project has failed. We stop the bleeding. We pick up the phone and we negotiate a settlement based on the actual security interests of the parties involved, not the moralistic crusades of the State Department. This requires humility, which is in short supply in Washington. It requires admitting that we were wrong, that we underestimated the enemy, and that we overestimated ourselves. It is time to demand accountability. The era of the blank check is over. The era of the general who fails upward is over. We need to clean house. Every general officer who signed off on these disastrous strategies, every intelligence official who cooked the books to please their political masters, and every politician who voted to fund this slaughter needs to be removed from power. We need competence. We need realism. We need leaders who care more about the safety and prosperity of the American people than they do about the borders of a corrupt proxy state in Eastern Europe. The warning lights are flashing red on the dashboard of our civilization. We can either pull over and fix the engine, or we can drive this car off the cliff. The choice is ours, but time is running out.